Hi there, I'm McDonnell Liu, and this is the Family Health Lab. I'm about to speak to Dr. James Muecke, eye surgeon, Australian of the Year 2020, and now outspoken critic of our food and our health system. Find out how James believes that we're being conned into sickness and ill health, the government policies and taxes that are supporting the food industry, and what we can do as individuals and families to take back control of our own health.
You're listening to the Family Health Lab. Healthy parents, healthy kids.
Welcome, James. Lovely to have you on.
Be with you this morning, Claire.
You're doing a phenomenal amount of work highlighting the link between sugars and chronic disease across Australia, but also it's an international problem. You've personally detoxed from sugar, I believe. I was just wondering how that went for you and what's your approach generally to health, your own health?
Yeah, Claire, I detoxed from sugar coming up to 3 years ago, actually. Not a complete detox. You know, I still indulge occasionally. In fact, I was on a whitewater rafting trip in Tasmania a couple of weeks ago, and it was quite a life-threatening experience, actually. And they had snacks on the trip, and unfortunately, I got tempted by chocolates during the trip, which has a bit of solace for what was a pretty terrifying experience. But in general, you know, I try to minimize my consumption of sugary drinks, ultra-processed products, and certainly seed oils as well, to try and maintain good metabolic health. And when I went through my initial detox in early 2020, it was quite an unpleasant experience. The symptoms of withdrawing from sugar are very, very confronting and quite nasty, and actually can be quite a shock, actually, if you haven't experienced it before. And for me, it really manifested on day one, and it was headaches. It was fatigue. It was, feeling that you were just so sluggish. You were walking through concrete. And then, the cravings also start quite rapidly as well. So within 24 hours of really removing significant sugary products. So I didn't do a hard line detox. So I basically just cut back on sugary drinks, including fruit juices. I cut back on ice cream, which was one of my absolute favorites, chocolates, lollies, biscuits, cakes, things like that, was the things that I gave up. And bang, it hits you really hard very quickly. The cravings just built over the next few days, and they were really tough to deal with, actually. And I found that occasionally I'll detox from coffee. I do enjoy a coffee a day, but from time to time I've detoxed from coffee. And that was actually, detoxing from sugar is much, much tougher. But I've learned from detoxing from coffee that a couple of Panadols helps you get through that really tough period. And so, some judicious use of paracetamol certainly helped me to get through it. The process took overall about a week. Certainly up to day 3, things started to ease off. And then after a week, I was pretty clear of it, which was reassuring, because you just don't know how long it can go on for. And I suppose, again, it depends on whether you really scrutinize every package of food and every fruit and everything you consume as to how hard you detox. But that was enough for me. And, after a week, I could then walk past the freezer and not have to jump in and grab the ice cream. It's quite liberating, actually, to detox from sugar. But it's very easy to jump back into it as well. It's amazingly how easy it is. And this is, I find, I'm quite sympathetic for people who are trying to detox. And for me, it was a physical dependency. So it's a bit like nicotine and some other things which are quite addictive products. I think sugar is even more addictive than nicotine. So it is physical dependency for me. For some people, it's a very deep psychological addiction, and that might be much, much tougher to actually maintain that abstinence from sugary products.
It's interesting, isn't it? When I cut down on my sugar, I hadn't realized how how much sugar I actually ate. I actually thought I didn't really eat that much. And it was when I cut out, after I put my children on their own low sugar diet, that then the liberation that you mentioned, that freedom, I realized how much I had been craving and how every coffee would be accompanied by some sort of brownie or chocolate or cake or something. And it was those combinations that I hadn't even realized. I believe it's sugar's addictive, and people are doing a lot of work on campaigning to get more of that understanding out there.
Interestingly, you probably heard me talk about these 5 A's of sugar toxicity. And I think for me, the big one is addiction, and it's often the elephant in the room, and the addiction is very, very powerful. Second is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress, to make us feel better when we're down. Third is accessibility. I mean, sugary products are literally everywhere in our environment. You can't walk into most service stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. You can't check out from most supermarket stores, even post offices and chemists these days, without being enticed by half-price chocolates and sugary drinks. Fourth A is addition. So about 75% of our food and drinks have added sugar, so it's very hard to escape. And finally, advertising. So our world is flooded with TV commercials and ads for sugary products. And all of these things make it very, very difficult for us to avoid sugary products. And I've no doubt that the ultra-processed food industry adds sugar to make them addictive, to make them enticing, and then you're reeled in. And it's, as I said before, it's very hard then to actually get off some of these products. But these products, not only do they have sugar, but they have refined carbohydrates and they have seed oils. And it's the combination of sugar, refined carbs, and seed oils, which the major ingredients of most ultra-processed products, which then create this metabolic shitstorm in our bodies. They're like a loaded gun pointing directly at our livers, causing metabolic dysfunction. And the combination of the three, all of which can independently give rise to metabolic dysfunction, but when you add them together, it really is very, very bad for our metabolic health.
5 A's, that's really, really worth remembering, and I'll write that up because they cover all of the points that drag us in. You're using language in your recent articles and your recent talks for Low Carb Down Under, for example. You're using cons bombarded with faced with sugar shovelers. But do you believe chronic disease, the epidemic, that food is a major factor, as we're seeing in research and huge scale studies, that the food we're eating every day is making us sick? For example, the treats and rewards at schools, the soft drink at a sports club. How damaging, how dangerous is that?
Yes, well, actually, if Simon Capewell's work out of the UK shows that our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than smoking, alcohol, and physical inactivity combined. So our poor diet is the big baddie that's underpinning of this chronic disease epidemic. I also suspect the mental health epidemic. So to me, this is the thing that we need to be focusing on. Exercise is important, but you can't outrun a bad diet. I've come up with this action strategy, and it involves also a number of strategies that start with the letter A. The first is awareness. So most people are not aware of the dangers of sugar and ultra-processed foods. And in fact, quite often, the Health Star rating system gives ultra-processed products a healthy 5-star or 4.5-star rating. And yet these things are not healthy for us. This is this Health Star rating system we have here in Australia is an industry device that's been designed by industry for industry. So it's not been designed with our health in mind. So an awareness element needs to be there, and that awareness really needs to start at schools. I mean, we know there are over 8,000 studies linking sugar to a range of chronic diseases. We know also that there is plenty of evidence out there linking the seed oils, the vegetable oils, to metabolic dysfunction. And yes, it may not be obvious in childhood, but the damage really starts early. And we actually know that a quarter of our kids are overweight or obese. A quarter of our kids at this point in time are overweight or obese. We're also seeing type 2 diabetes. This is a disease. When I was in medical school, it was known as maturity onset diabetes. We're now seeing kids in this country as young as 3. In fact, Northern Australia leads the world for type 2 diabetes in children, not something that we should be proud of.
My goodness, it's frightening. It's really frightening. And it's worrying that we're normalizing unhealthy weight. With obesity and being overweight is the norm now. 2/3 of Australians and a quarter of our children, as you say, and the language around that is becoming very, very accepted. Whereas really, it's a sign of the beginning stages of a lifelong health problem. So when children are facing that, we've really got big worries for them.
Absolutely. In fact, if we look at even this sort of obesity issue and the whole fat shaming movement that's arisen around it, I mean, I'm absolutely do not condone fat shaming, but we should not be normalizing obesity. Only 1 in every 200 people who are obese are metabolically healthy. So the vast majority are metabolically not healthy. We should absolutely not be normalizing this. And yet you have ultra-processed food companies such as Nestle's who've started a movement called Be Body Positive. Basically, be positive about your body, keep on eating their ultra-processed rubbish.
When you hear terms like willpower, it's really down to personal choice. It's our genetics, really shaming people. How does that make you feel? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in fact, again, coming back to Nestle's in their type 2 diabetes webpage, I think the first sentence is type 2 diabetes is caused by genetics. So they're focusing on genetics. So that does frustrate me. This is not genetic. We have had 4-fold growth in type 2 diabetes worldwide over the last 40 years. In Aboriginal people in Australia, First Nations, Indigenous people, we've seen more than an 80-fold increase in the last 40 years, just over one generation. This cannot be genetic. This is lifestyle. Yes, genetics might load the gun, but diet pulls the trigger. Yes, people may have a genetic tendency towards obesity or type 2 diabetes, but it's not caused by genes. And there's no magical genetic therapies that are going to release people from this. It really should be focused, once again, on our diet.
Absolutely. And you've been doing a lot of campaigning over the last 3 years since you became the Australian of the Year 2020. So how did you come to your journey? And if you just wouldn't mind going right the way back, because this journey of campaigning on health and public health and hard-hitting campaigns and commercials that you're bringing out, you're doing a phenomenal amount of work in this space. But over the last decades, you've also been involved and founded and charities, not-for-profits around public health, eyesight charities. So I'm really interested in what's kind of sparked your interest in humanitarian work. Was it your early career and your experiences in rural communities in Asia and Africa and Jerusalem, or would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. Well, in fact, I won the Australian of the Year award because of my work with Sight for All. But I decided to use the platform of Australian of the Year to advocate for type 2 diabetes, to raise awareness and to really bring it into sharp focus in our conscience, because it's become such a huge problem. We now have 1.8 billion with diabetes in this country. It's the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults. So me as an eye surgeon, the link was very much there. So I've been in my clinical capacity dealing with the blinding complications of diabetes for the 32 years I've been in this profession. And what I've noted is the growth in the number of patients I'm treating every year, particularly with sight-threatening eye disease due to type 2 diabetes. And I think the thing, we can go back and talk about some of the very confronting experiences I've had, which has really driven, for me, a humanitarian spirit, and some of the early experiences I had in Asia. We can come back and chat to those. But if we just look here at the type 2 diabetes issue at the moment, in late 2018, I wanted to create a documentary about the experience of blindness, what it means to be blind. And I interviewed 10 people, and my son, who's a filmmaker, he did the filming for this documentary, talking heads, really, talking portraits. And I chose 4 kids who were born blind, 4 elderly people who are slowly going blind at the end of their life, and 2 people who suddenly went blind in the middle of their lives. I mean, they're all fascinating stories, particularly the kids, but the ones which were absolutely the most confronting were the 2 who went blind in the middle of their life. just turn off my phone. Sorry about that. So one of them was a man, his name was Neil Hansel, from a poor socio-economic background, who went to bed one evening at the age of 50 and woke up blind in both eyes the next morning and remains blind to this day. And his story was so immensely powerful. And in fact, I've created a couple of TV commercials using his very, very powerful story. And the other one, which is actually a young woman, and she was actually a high-flying corporate executive, and she was just simply too busy to have her eyes checked. And unfortunately became blind as a result of her diabetes and remained blind to this day. So you have someone from a wealthy background and someone from a poor background for different reasons, and they're both blind. So this can actually impact on everyone. And of the 1.8 million Australians, we have about 100,000 with sight-threatening eye disease. But of all of the people with diabetes, well over half are not having their regular eye checks. And that's why it's become such a blind problem in our society. So when I received the award initially, I thought, gee, this is something we need to raise awareness of, this very important fact. If you have diabetes, just get your eyes checked. You don't want to spend a lifetime in the dark and being blind. It impacts heavily on so many things in your life. And so when you have something that's so avoidable, and we know that 98% of the blindness due to diabetes is preventable or treatable, so nearly all of it is avoidable. It just shouldn't be happening. But if you then realize that type 2 diabetes, which makes up about 90% of cases, is a largely avoidable man-made dietary disease, we should not be seeing this happening at all.
In your 30-plus year career, you're seeing this escalate. And this unnecessary misery, this suffering that's completely avoidable. And you're coming to realize throughout your career that sugar, processed foods is the cause of it. And that's why you used your platform as Australian of the Year to do this campaigning. I heard you say that within 1 year you thought your work would be done, and it wasn't. And so you thought you would kind of go in and campaign, raise awareness, and then people would want to take note in government. What's your experience of the policymakers and the policies around food and the harm of food?
Well, I met with Greg Hunt in 2020. I met with the South Australian Health Minister as well. Greg Hunt now has moved on, but I didn't sadly have any luck there. But of course, the government at the time was completely consumed by the COVID pandemic, which broke out literally a couple of months after I received the award. And it made it very difficult for me to really have a huge impact through that year. But I suppose one of the benefits of COVID, not that there are many benefits of COVID pandemics, but is that my role, rather than just being a year-long role, has actually rolled into now 3 years and beyond. So I can still use the platform. In fact, I met with Mark Butler, the current health minister, a few weeks ago. In fact, we have a follow-up conversation coming up next week. I've met the new health minister in South Australia. So and we have had a meeting with one of the senators last week. So I'm continuing to leverage this really powerful platform to have that access into people that hopefully can make a difference. And to me, this is the second day of my action strategy. The awareness is one, but ultimately awareness is kind of putting the blame back onto the victims. Although there's an awareness raising, which is really critical, what we don't want to be doing is using victims such as Neil Hansel, the guy that woke up blind that morning, to tell these really powerful stories, because it's in essence it's just victim blaming, where what we truly need is accountability. And what we have is an addictive product, and we have industry which are preying on people's addictions. They're preying on the vulnerable. They're preying on children. And I think that's absolutely disgraceful. And we see, once you actually see it, everywhere in our environment, the advertising and on TV, the ads aimed at children on TV, something like 3 TV commercials around healthy products at every hour aimed at kids. There's 100 promotions every week on social media aimed at teens. So these ultra-processed food industries, sugary drinks industries, fast food industries are absolutely targeting our kids. And once again, it's disgraceful. So we need to hold these industries to account. I've met with a number of the supermarket chains. I've had conversations with Officeworks. I've had conversations with Australia Post, with Chemist Warehouse, trying to discourage this preying on consumers, particularly the sugary products, which are at counters in all of these stores. That shouldn't be happening. And really, we're seeing very little movement. Fortunately, Australia Post took heed, and they removed sugary products from something like 700 of their corporate stores during 2020. So that was, to me, quite a coup. But it's still going on. And I think ultimately our government needs to be holding these businesses and their industry allies to account. And we also need accountability from our government that allows the predatory marketing that goes on everywhere in our food environment. The advertising at bus stops, which is just incessant, the advertising on buses, on public buildings, it just has to stop. Because, if you are trying your hardest, and I know this in myself, if you're trying your hardest to avoid unhealthy products, when you have this constant bombardment, it makes it very, very difficult to maintain that abstinence from unhealthy foods.
It really does. It's more than a challenge, and that guilt that people feel, and that shame, that they can't avoid it, that sugar addiction. It really feels to me very, very unfair to put that back on families and young children when they're being bombarded by the advertising. The products are in their schools, they're being served in their hospitals and their schools, and their tuck shops, and then in their sports clubs are being sponsored almost, or they get advertising to kind of promote their brands through children's sports clubs. We've just got a box of Cadbury's sent home by our son's basketball team, because Cadbury kindly want to raise money for shirts, and in England when I was living and I was working in there, Nestle managed to get into schools through the breakfast programs, which is a major kind of brand promotion and brand recognition, getting your Cheerios into school setting. So putting this back onto parents and children to manage just doesn't seem fair. So your action plan, you were talking through that awareness and getting kind of the government and looking at the policies. What are your thoughts on the tax system around ultra-processed foods, around sugary foods? I know this is something that you've been speaking about and you've written articles on, and you've uncovered quite an unfair system, I would say.
So a tax on sugary products is a strategy that's been used in a number of countries, and it certainly has shown to reduce purchase and consumption of sugary products. Ultimately, whether it had the impact on obesity and type 2 diabetes and metabolic health, I don't think the evidence is out there, but it certainly has been shown to work, but it's certainly not palatable here in Australia by either of the major parties. So it's almost certainly we're not going to see it here in this country. So something that I've been talking to our health minister about is the fact that the ultra-processed food industry, the sugary drinks industry, the fast food industry are receiving enormous tax breaks, tax subsidies. Basically, they're receiving tax breaks, the marketing of their unhealthy products. So they're receiving tax breaks which allow them to market their unhealthy substances at us, reeling us in, and making the cost of these products cheaper. And then there's a secondary impact on the government, who then has to bill the health bill to actually deal with the health consequences of these unhealthy products. So my strong belief is that what we should be doing, rather than looking at a tax on sugary products, is actually remove the subsidies, remove the tax breaks for marketing, for research and development for these industries. And to date, I think in the order of $5 billion in tax breaks. So that's basically $5 billion the taxpayer are propping up these industries in this country. And can you imagine if they remove that $5 billion worth of tax breaks, and that $5 billion was then reinvested into all sorts of things. Let's say a healthy school lunch program, raising awareness in schools, subsidizing real food, healthy food for people in lower socioeconomic areas or people with metabolic dysfunction, it could actually help turn around this epidemic of chronic disease and type 2 diabetes.
Amazing what you've uncovered in your investigations. And that is information. I've been very interested in this space as a nutritionist, and I've got children myself. And that I haven't heard anybody kind of talking in that detail about that tax situation. And I would imagine there's some similar situations in other countries. America has got a lot of bias and a lot of conflicts of interest within their food system and their school food system as well. So that's fascinating. And I really do hope that with you kind of calling this out and having those meetings that can be instrumental in changing those policies over time. The sugar levy, I'm a fan of the sugar levy in different countries. Mexico and Britain has I think had a really good impact on cutting down sugar and the acceptability. It's another tool, but if the political will isn't there, it will take a grassroots to kind of to increase the attention and get that buy-in from government. But there are different strategies as with your action plan, and we need a number of them. Across your investigations, your research over the last year, you definitely have uncovered a lot of information. What has shocked you the most?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, there's, I think, as you mentioned before, the vested interests which permeate this whole space quite deeply. And it's troubling. I mean, I was on the National Diabetes Strategy Expert Advisory Group, and I'm really thrilled to say that I was able to get remission of type 2 diabetes into that document for the very first time, giving hope to all of these patients that are impacted by type 2 diabetes and its life-threatening and life-changing consequences. So this is a disease. Diabetes Australia, until early last year, the very first line on their type 2 diabetes webpage was type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease, but it's not a progressive disease. It doesn't have to be a progressive disease, but most people with this disease and their families are not aware of this. So we now have the opportunity. We know there are 3 clinically proven methods for putting type 2 diabetes into remission. So that was quite a battle. I thought it should have been a major goal under the National Diabetes Strategy, but it's come under one of the goals, which is good. At least we have it there. But there were definitely vested interest trying to minimize that message from experts who had their own conflicts of interest, either by the processed food industry or by the pharmaceutical industry. And so this permeates this conversation at literally every level. One of the other things, I think, not just the opportunity to put type 2 diabetes into remission, but also the opportunity to prevent the disease in the first place, not just type 2, but obesity and other forms of metabolic dysfunction. It is the biggest driver, as I've said, of our poor health. So the opportunity to prevent, and again, let's look at our dietary guidelines, the document that informs how we should eat. And it is a high carb, low fat dietary recommendation, but it's very powerful because it informs what should be eaten from childcare through to aged care, in the defence force, in hospitals, in prisons, etc., etc. It informs our army of nutritionists, dietitians, health practitioners, health educators in the food industry. So it's very, very powerful. And yet it's recommending high carbohydrate eating pattern. Now, metabolic dysfunction is by definition insulin resistance. So if you have insulin resistance, you are carbohydrate intolerant. Now we look at the Australian population, over 2/3 of Australian adults are overweight or obese. So at least 2/3 of us are metabolic dysfunctional. In America, something like 93% of Americans are now metabolic dysfunctional. So we are, as a nation and as a species, metabolically unhealthy, carbohydrate intolerant. The last thing we should be doing is eating lots of carbohydrates. So we need to flip this dietary recommendation on its head. We have to reduce the carbohydrates that we're consuming to try and restore. And we know that is one of the strategies that can actually put type 2 diabetes to remission, reducing our carbohydrate intake There are over 100 controlled clinical trials to show it works. And I've noticed that in myself and actually in my patients. I now have quite a number of patients who are putting their type 2 diabetes into remission. They're coming off their insulin very quickly. They're coming off their medication. They're losing a bunch of weight. They're feeling better, more clarity of thought, and they're actually seeing better. And what I'm noticing as well is that the eye complications, the blinding complications are also reversing as well. And that's something that's very, very exciting for me to see and experience as a health practitioner.
Absolutely. That is exciting. And it's terrifying that we've got ourselves into that situation where our diet has led to that level of disease and that eyesight complications and eyesight loss. And the diabetes type 2, we talk about a lot in this space because we can demonstrate it can be reversed and controlled or prevented. When I first arrived from England and moved over here to Western Australia, I attended a diabetes sensation event, and I was absolutely gobsmacked when I heard them talking about this progressive disease that can't be reversed and has to be controlled by increasing amounts of medication. And that was 2020. And the tens of thousands of case studies and research studies, and it was very internationally becoming much more widely accepted. So in light of that evidence, they were totally ignoring it. I was absolutely gobsmacked. So you've mentioned there that you have campaigned for, demonstrated and shown the evidence and changed the diabetes statement to accept that there is remission. And that's an amazing thing for Australian public health. It's actually incredible that it wasn't happening before that. I mean, that work that you've done, that's really shifting the whole dialogue around how people can manage their health, and hopefully over time the support that they will be able to access, because even though that shifted statement is a major win and should have happened through our trusted agencies anyway, but that major win hopefully will now lead to us being able to push more support for cutting down sugars and carbs. When we talk about sugars and carbs, what kinds of foods are we talking about?
Well, particularly the refined carbohydrates. Sugars, I think it's pretty obvious, but there are actually something like 260 alternate names for sugar. There's about 63 common ones, and the food industry often use those names to confuse the consumer. So it's a matter of being aware of all the different names that sugar has. But I think one of the things which people don't realize, which I call sugar in disguise, are the refined carbohydrates. So products such as highly refined white flour, white rice, peeled white potatoes, they're virtually pure starch. And starch, all that is simply a long chain of glucose, which breaks down into single glucose molecules as soon as it reaches the gut. In fact, it happens as soon as these products reach our mouth. So if people then are suddenly aware that refined carbohydrates, pastas, white breads, particularly those highly refined, ultra-processed white breads and pastas, are not healthy for us. And that's a really, really important. So, cut back on your intake. And this is often very difficult for people, particularly when it's a cultural thing to have pasta or white rice. So you just reduce the amounts that you're consuming and particularly avoid the highly refined rice and the highly refined flours. You're back to, whole grain flours, whole meal pasta, wholemeal, brown rice, things like that, rather than the highly refined version. That's certainly a positive direction as well. And the other thing that we really need to keep on remembering are the seed oils, which are metabolic disruptors that cause insulin resistance, independent of sugar and refined carbohydrates. And unfortunately, fast food is all deep fried in seed oils. When you go out to restaurants, I suspect most restaurants use seed oils to cook foods in, and certainly at home, avoid using these seed oils, vegetable oils, they're called euphemistically. Go back to olive oil, lard, butter, coconut oil, things like that. They're saturated fats, but what we do know is that natural saturated fats, such as found in products that I've just mentioned, in full fat dairy, in eggs, in meat, are not linked to cardiovascular disease. There's no strong evidence, and we now have over 20 studies, 4 Cochrane reviews, exonerating natural saturated fats and causing cardiovascular disease. You do not need to fear natural saturated fats. Fear vegetable oils, fear margarine, fear these spreadable butters, which are full of vegetable oils as well. They are the ones that we should be avoiding in order to restore our metabolic health.
And that dovetails back into the Australian dietary guidelines that you've just mentioned earlier. That the information that's coming to the public through their school education, through the school meals, through the hospitals and prisons, and the advice from the dietitians, and all of that food policy, you're highlighting that it's out of step with the evidence. The saturated fat, natural whole foods with saturated fat shouldn't be feared, but seed oil, vegetable oil, margarine, pasties, the Australian pie may have those seed oils in. So the common foods that we've been steered towards, low fat and everyday household foods, even cereals with health washing notices on them and that are advertised and we can get in our schools again at the breakfast clubs. Those are the types of foods that we're highlighting. Potentially, if you want to kind of improve your health, your metabolic health, avoid disease, you want to be shifting away from and going more to whole foods and real food products, and back to the natural foods of eggs and meat and seeds, nuts, vegetables, those type of foods. Australian dietary guidelines, as in this phase, you're talking about them a lot, and I hear about them a lot, but I think that the general public aren't really aware of them. It is important for them that these change. What's the current situation with the guidelines? They're under review currently, aren't they? We're halfway through the review.
Yeah, so they're currently under review, and that will probably come out in 2024. But I met with the NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, in 2020 because they are the overseeing body that basically orchestrates that review process. And I said that this is going to take another 3-4 years to see this document. In the meantime, we're going to see 100,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes in Australia every year. We're going to see 15,000 or more deaths due to type 2 diabetes in this country every year until that document's released. We need to turn this around more rapidly. The Australian dietary guidelines, they themselves say they're for healthy Australians. But as I mentioned before, when 2/3 of Australian adults and a quarter of our kids are overweight or obese, the majority of us we're not healthy metabolically. So these guidelines are no longer relevant to the majority of Australians. So what they should be doing, I think, is focusing on guidelines for people with metabolic dysfunction, people with type 2 diabetes. And we have seen the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners has released a fabulous guideline on how to reverse metabolic dysfunction using diet. And there are a number of other bodies that have also released documents that help people in their metabolic health journey, help health practitioners as well. So this is really critical, actually. Another thing, my 3 A's, the third one is assistance. And so medical students need assistance. My son is now in 4th year medical school. He was in 2nd year 2 years ago. And the opportunity to do a course in nutrition science was actually an elective. So it wasn't even compulsory. This is our biggest driver of our core health, not even compulsory in many of our health training grounds. So clearly medical students need assistance and general practitioners need assistance. They need to know that there are 3 clinically proven methods for putting type 2 diabetes into remission. Most of them wouldn't be aware. I was only made aware a couple of years ago. And then they need continuing professional development to actually, this needs to be brought back into training of GPs and specialists so that they are aware of what these opportunities are, and incredible opportunities for patients with type 2 diabetes. Imagine being told for 20 years, and I have patients who have had type 2 diabetes for 20 years who have now put it into remission. Imagine being told for 20 or more years that this is a progressive disease. Nothing you can do. You just have a lifetime of crippling medical expenses and a battery of devastating complications to look forward to. Now to know that you can actually reverse this is hugely liberating. So medical practitioners, dietitians, nutritionists, health coaches, exercise physiologists, they need to be brought up to speed, need to be injected into the training ground for all of these health professionals that are working in this space. And it needs to be injected ASAP. But unfortunately, many of the bodies still count the Australian Dietary Guidelines as being the preeminent document for guiding this process. But as I say, this is now no longer a relevant document. It's a high carb eating approach, which is not conducive to good metabolic health. But unfortunately, the Royal College of GPs, Diabetes Australia, Dietitians Australia, Kidney Health Australia, Cancer Council Australia, you name it, they continue to say eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So until we see this shift in the dietary guidelines in a couple of years, hopefully we'll see the shift. I'm not even optimistic that we'll see a big shift, but hopefully we will see a shift. And it's not until we see this paradigm shift that we will start to get all of these bodies on board, and we'll have it ingrained in the training of all of these really critical health professions.
There's a group of us involved in putting a petition together that will be circulating, and members of the public, because often I'm asked, by the public, how can they get involved? So that's one thing that they could do. They could sign petitions, they could raise awareness, they can campaign within their own schools. What are your thoughts on how the public can get involved and make this change? When I first had children or went into the went to the play groups, lots of parents were really concerned about the squash and the biscuit that the child was given, their toddler. And it was every single little activity you went to. But by the time you reach school, you're kind of, they've kind of lost the battle. So they just go with the normal culture. And then they may see repercussions in their children in a young age or later. But a lot of people want to shift the tide and be part of this. So how have you got suggestions of how people can make change?
Yes, and you mentioned just a few there, which was fantastic. And as you say, in schools, this has become normalized, bringing a chocolate cake for your birthday, bringing your bags of lollies for all your classmates for your birthday. That's become the norm now. And I have a nutritionist colleague that I'm working with at the moment who's on her school council and is having a battle there, even trying to hold her school to account. We have a school's policy of what should be eaten in schools, and this has not even been adhered to. So these schools need to be held to account. The contractors that they use to run the canteens and tuck shops need to be held to account. So there's certainly people can really start to direct these important issues to the schools. This needs to start in the school ground for sure. There are a bunch of other things people can do. You mentioned the public contribution to the Australian Dietary Guideline process is a really important one. There are a bunch of movements now that you can follow. That sugar movement is one such example. Sugar by half, Peter Buchner's movement is also a really powerful one. So there are a bunch of movements that people can follow. There are a bunch of campaigns as well that are out there that people can subscribe to. And I've done a number of posts on social media about these various things. There are a bunch of Facebook groups. Low Carb Down Under is a fabulous Facebook group and platform website that has a directory for health coaches, health practitioners across the country, state by state, who can help people reverse their metabolic dysfunction. But if people are interested in just joining Facebook groups and state-based Facebook groups or social media groups, you have nice supportive environments that can help people also in this pathway, particularly if they have type 2 diabetes. So there are a bunch of things that people can do and write to their local member, write to their local council, to hold councils to account for what's being advertised in the council areas. So there's a bunch of things people can do. That's just touched on a few small ideas.
Okay, thank you. And what are you excited for next? What campaigns have you got coming up or projects that you're really looking forward to the impact that they're going to make?
Well, I'm involved in what's called a network for systemic change. This is something, when you have a big social or systemic problem, let's say such as climate change or such as the obesity or type 2 diabetes epidemics, there's no one person, no one entity, no one organization that can turn it around. So you need to actually weave all of these entities in a network. And so I came up with I didn't come up with the concept, but I facilitated the creation of a network for systemic change to rid Australia of type 2 diabetes. It's called #Type2Free. And so we've had a number of convenings of the network steering group over the past year. And early next year, we're going to go live with it. And what that will do is create a number of working groups that can work on different facets of what's needed to reverse this type 2 diabetes epidemic.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this year, awareness raising, accountability, assistance, and there'll be multiple things within each of those areas that we need to do. And there'll be working groups working on all of those. So it's quite an exciting time. I think this is the one thing that can have the impact that we ultimately need to turn this round, to turn this tidal wave of devastation to individuals and their families.
So a large network, getting those skills, that expertise out there, campaigning, and then ultimately putting out tools and support for people. That we'll look out for that as that develops. That sounds really, really much needed in Australia. So that sounds like it's going to be really important work. And then finally, what would you recommend, a particular book or a resource for people who want to learn more, or a talk that you really enjoy, or a platform that people could kind of link into?
Wow. Yes. I mean, there's lots, and there's lots of books. I think the book for me that really started me on this journey was a revelation actually in early 2020 when I decided to take on this battle. The book that was really instrumental for me was The Diabetes Code by Jason Full, a nephrologist from Canada. And that's definitely worth a read, particularly for health practitioners. It's kind of heavy going perhaps for the general public, but Peter Bruckner's book, A Fat Lot of Good, is a fantastic book. And that's probably directed more at the lay person. It's very accessible, very understandable. And Peter's been a fabulous campaigner in this world for some years now. And Peter Bruckner's also, he runs Sugar by Far, but has also recently, or let's say over the last year or so, has started Defeat Diabetes, which is an app which is specifically designed for Australians. It's been designed by health professionals, Australian health professionals, and designed for people with type 2 diabetes, potentially be able to reverse their metabolic dysfunction. So they're three things that I would definitely recommend. What else? Robert Lustig's talks online are always fascinating and illuminating. Gary and Belinda Fettke's talks, Paul Mason's talks, I could go on there. They're all on YouTube, but they are fabulous. But Low Carb Down Under hosts most, if not all of those talks by practitioners who are deeply understanding the science and not conflicted by the food industry, pharmaceutical industry, that really understand this. And I think they're very, very much worth listening to. And particularly Belinda Fettke's talks, which really talk about the religious ideologies, and particularly the combination with the processed food industry, which is really a big and scary driver of this persistence of the messaging that cereals and grains and processed foods are important for our metabolic health. They are absolutely not.
It's really interesting when you start to hear those talks and hear how the messaging has come across and how we've been influenced over time. It's important. Thank you for those resources. Just a comment on them, but like you say, they're fantastic resources, and we do have the ability to research and find out more, as you have done. And when I first started my journey into looking into ketogenic diets and for the health of my children and low carb and sugar free and all of that, it was a completely different field. There was so little information. just no recipes online that we could find. And in 10 years, the space has really, really, really changed and developed. So people can access information through Low Carb Down Under and all the other resources and the amazing book. And your work, it's an uphill battle. But I'd like to thank you for all you're doing. And I'm really excited myself to kind of watch as this develops. So thank you very much, James. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely welcome, Claire, and thank you for all you're doing as well. And, this is mainstream now. This is not cloak and dagger stuff. BSIRO now have a number of low carb cookbooks. Women's Weekly have low carb resources as well. So this has become mainstream. It's not quackery, but it really works, and it's quite extraordinary as a health practitioner to see it work firsthand in my patient. I want all my colleagues to see it work in their patients because they can be instrumental in this whole process. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to be with you this morning, and congratulations on all you're doing as well, Claire.
Thanks, James.